Hello, everybody. We're going to go ahead and get started. So it's my distinct pleasure today to introduce you to Sean McFate. We were colleagues at NDU together, and now still at colleagues here at Georgetown, where he is an adjunct faculty member for us. So thrilled to have him open up his first public event after being in the news about it. But first event here at Georgetown talking about his new book, which is quite controversial. I'm sure you guys will have lots of questions. And I'll go ahead and turn it over to Sean.
Thanks. Thank you very much. It's great to be here, and thanks for coming out on a January day, especially a cold one. Can you hear me back here? Okay. Do I need to stand in front of this camera or not?
Yes.
I do. Okay. All right. Okay. At least somebody knows. Can I stand? Well, let's see. I don't want to stand your way either. Is this okay? Why don't you tell me so I know how, before we even begin. I'm so sorry for this earlier. But it's my pleasure to be here with you today. Is everybody here like a SSP student? Great. So today, this book is released, The New Rules of War. And thank you very much. Thank you, one person. Thank you. Oh, okay. All right, great. Authors love their ego stroke, of course. This book will be controversial. It'll make some heads explode in the Pentagon, but that's an okay thing. It is written for a mass audience. It's not an academic book. It's undergirded by academic, rigorous theory, but it's also a lot of history and also a lot of personal experience. I have a background in this that's not purely scholastic. But it was written so that my mother could understand it. Okay? And it's written to be read. You could read it both seriously at the library, but also waiting for an airport, at a gate at an airport. The first question you're gonna probably ask me, since you're all astute SSP students, is like, oh, but Dr. McFate, there are no rules of war, right? There are no rules of war. And I find this personally to be not correct. So when we think of like Clausewitz, and he says that war is, policy by other means, call that an idea, call that a maxim, call that a rule. Same with Sun Tzu when he says all war is deception. It too is a sort of a rule. So I'm using rules loosely. It's not like laws of war. It's not like sort of a Jominian principles of war. It's just we've been studying war for over 2,500 years. And we have some ideas as to what works and what doesn't work. And this is part of that canon. So I start off by rejecting the idea that there's no rules of war, which has become fashionable to say. We can discuss why that perception exists today, but I don't want to waste time right now on this. All right? So the reason I wrote this book is I was curious to know about this question. Why don't we win more wars? Now, it's a question that's very unpopular to ask in the Pentagon, as you can imagine. It's something that's unpopular to ask among vets. But I think we have to be honest with ourselves. We have to ask this question. Why don't we win more wars? The last time we won a war decisively, the world ran on vacuum tubes. The day before D-Day, General Patton stands up in a makeshift wooden stage and talks to soldiers about to launch on the biggest amphibious invasion I think the world had seen at that point. And said losing is hateful to Americans. Americans don't lose wars. Americans do not lose wars. But since then, all we've done is stalemate or lose wars. Korea was a stalemate. Vietnam turned communist. Iraq and Afghanistan. I don't think anybody could reasonably argue now that we won Iraq or Afghanistan. Even there are Pew Research polls from last year that show pretty significantly that most Americans, as well as most Brits, say that we, quote, mostly failed in these wars. Even John McCain, last year on his deathbed, said the Iraq War, which he worked so hard to launch and escalate, was a failure. This is not a Democrat versus Republican thing. Republicans got us into wars they couldn't get us out of. Democrats promised to get us out of wars that they didn't. This is not, this is not a White House versus Congress thing. Does anybody know the last time we declared war? Well, last time Congress declared war? World War II. World War II. As a troop leader, as a vet myself, we fought wars in Korea, the Dominican Republic, Vietnam, Grenada, Panama, the Balkans, Somalia, Iraq, Afghanistan. I want to know what people died for, right? So it's where has Congress been but AWOL? Also, it's not just an American thing, and this is what's frightening. The French lost in Algeria and Indochina. The British lost in Palestine and Cyprus, as well as other places, arguably Ireland. The Soviets, of course, in Afghanistan, their Afghanistan moment. And the Israelis against Hezbollah in Lebanon. In all these cases, you had very high-end, high-tech, advanced militaries losing to vastly inferior foes. And the big question is, has the West forgotten how to win wars? It's an obvious question, but nobody wants to ask it because the implications are too terrifying. You think about the implications of that, too terrifying. So we have the best troops. We have the best technology. We have the best training. We have the biggest budget. So what's the problem? Why are we losing? It's a reasonable question to ask. There's many different answers out there. Some solutions are we have to double down on a core strength. For example, we need more money. We need more technology. This thing, what is this? Does anybody know what this is? The F-35, the most expensive weapon in history. This program cost $1.5 trillion. That is more than Russia's GDP. Right? We fought 2 long wars. How many combat missions did this fly? Does anybody know? 0 combat missions in 2 long wars. When you look at a weapons system, its worth is measured by its utility. We're buying more of these too. A lot more. The last time we had a strategic dogfight was probably the Korean War. So why do we need more of these? I don't know. You could argue we might need more of these, but why is there a pilot involved? So this is the definition of insanity, doing the same thing again and again and expecting a different result. Another solution or answer is denial. Oh, we didn't win in Afghanistan, but we didn't lose either. As attractive as that is, and as much as I have friends and vets and family members, not my family, people who've lost people there, that is not honest. We have to be honest with ourselves. We have to be honest with ourselves. When you measure victory and loss, the only thing that really matters is, did you achieve your war objectives that you went into the war with? Now, sometimes those war objectives can change, but sometimes you see politicians artificially moving the goalpost to rationalize failure, and history is never fooled. So initially, when the US went into Iraq or Afghanistan and said, we're going to make this into a democracy and there'll be peace, love, and unicorns and all these things, we have to be honest with ourselves and say, did we achieve what we wanted to achieve? And if you didn't, you really can't say you won the war. You really can't say you won the war. Nor is there this idea of bifurcated victory, that you can win all the military engagements but yet lose the war. There's no such thing. Victory and loss in war at the strategic level only makes sense in a political context, because wars are politics. All right, so another answer is faith in international law, international organizations. I think that the United Nations, for all the great things it does in the world, peace management may arguably not be one of them. That's what I would argue. If you look at the Middle East, you look at Africa, South Asia, the United Nations has a spotty record. And those who think, and as a vet myself, the idea of laws of war is a magnificent fiction. Purely marvelous. but it doesn't. That's not how warfare works. Today, I think it's hubris to try to regulate it. It's hubris to try to legislate it. Often, kind-hearted solutions end up with most people getting more killed. This is not just me. This is Clausewitz, book 1. Lastly, and this is what astonishes me most, is that some people say war is just unknowable. So they throw up their hands and give up. What's interesting about this is that the people who say this now are a lot of foreign policy experts in this town, national security experts in this town. They are the people who said, Iraq has weapons of mass destruction, trust us. And they said, oh, the wars will be short and easy and will pay for themselves. Rumsfeld said the Iraq war would take days, weeks at the most, certainly not months, right? Then also it continues. Well, things are not going on well, but counterinsurgency will surely save Iraq and Afghanistan. And then that failed. They're like, well, a surge. We need a surge. And then that didn't work. And then they're like, oh, war's unknowable. And this is not true. So it's only unknowable to some. It's only unknowable to some, which is why you're here, so you become masters of war and masters of peace. So there's a saying that maybe you've heard, generals always fight the last war, or generals always fight the last successful war. This truism happens to be true. Our strategic paradigm for today in this country remains our last successful war, which is World War II. It is the conventional war paradigm. Now, being savvy SSP students, we don't have to have a big discussion is exactly what that means. We generally think of interstate warfare fought by industrial strength militaries, fueled by ideologies of patriotism, nationalism, etc. But conventional war, I argue, has a beginning, middle, and end. The beginning was Napoleon. The middle could be Crimea or the U.S. Civil War. The end was World War II and World War I. I look at those actually as the same war. Like this, sort of like the Peloponnesian War was 30 years. World War I and World War II in some ways are the same war with a 20-year, pause X. But conventional war is dead. And that's the first rule of the 10 new rules of war. Is we struggle because we're trying to fight a type of warfare that doesn't exist. And this comes from, it comes from things like World War II, but also it's reinforced by our ideas factories, like in Hollywood and novels. So Tom Clancy, some think of him as a god. I remember when I was a cadet in the Army, people, like junior officers, would run around with a copy of this book, Red Storm Rising, under their little chicken wing, thinking that this was the future of war. Has anybody read Red Storm Rising? This depicts World War III between the Soviet Union and NATO. It was written in 1986. It was an instant bestseller. Everybody was reading it. And the way it worked is that this was basically World War II. That the Soviets would attack using, sneaky, dishonorable tactics, a sneak attack, and then the NATO had to rush in and beat them back, led by a heroic United States military, and curiously, no nukes went off in this. It was just pure World War II again. And it became a bestseller in part because it spoon-fed our military's confirmation bias back to itself. And this, does anybody know what was really going on in the Soviet Union in 1986? It was busy imploding, is what it was doing, right? It was busy imploding. 30 months after this got published, the Berlin Wall fell down. But curiously enough, that's not what the CIA here was peddling. They were reading this book and not reading their own cables. And they went around this town saying, oh, the Soviet Union's never been stronger or more aggressive than before. They're going to, there could be World War III tomorrow and we will die. Which of course was totally wrong. They had just one job, they got it, they blew it. Does anybody know who was leading the CIA's charge on this at this time? The director of intelligence was on this issue?
Gates.
Gates, right. Not Bill Gates, right? Bob Gates. It did not hurt his career. He became the DCI after this, which is incredible to think about, the head of intelligence, and then he became SecDef many years later. And we laud him, but I think this is an interesting question to ask ourselves about his legacy. And of course we see this today. We see Call of Duty, I mean we see war, like Star Wars is basically conventional war in space, right? I mean conventional war is everywhere. It's how we as a people conceive of war. And when you ask people about the future of war, it's usually World War II with better technology. Robots and, AI, whatever AI even means, we don't know. Cyber war, it's like ones and zeros in space. So this is the problem, is that this is wrong, because it misleads us. Right? It is wrong. So the first rule of war is that conventional war is dead. This will make some heads explode in the Pentagon, particularly in the departments of Navy and Air Force, who have been kind of sidelined the last 20 years of war. And this is even more astounding, that there's nothing more unconventional today than conventional war. Red here is conventional war, state-and-state conflicts. Blue is everything else. This is the Uppsala correlates of war, which you all know about. It's pretty clear, right? What's important? But how much of our budget goes to preparing for war down in the red? How many billions of dollars? It's astounding. So no wonder Afghanistan is the longest war in U.S. history. No wonder. So when I ask you today, what are today's biggest threats? What are they? Yelp out a few. Climate change. Russia. China. Overextension is a good one. What's another one? Nuclear weapons. Is that nuclear is a big weapon? Yeah, sure. Because who's gonna use it, right? I mean, France has nuclear weapons. So these are some great examples. We could spend all day listing what the threats are, and you could say things like deficit. You could say other things too, like what happens if there's a run on the U.S. dollar. We can get really imaginative about this. But while these threats are bad, they are not the worst. The worst, at least this is my interpretation, is systemic. There's a systemic threat that's emerging in 25 years that I call durable disorder. What is durable disorder? It is an emerging global system that can contain but not solve problems. This is antithetical to the Fukuyama thesis that after the Berlin Wall fell down that we'd have political utopia for here on out. For what's that book or article called? End of History, right? Very famous. Contrary, history is not ended, and the American political ideology is not reigned supreme. Instead, it's kind of gone the other way. This is a systemic threat. It is not new. So think of the Middle Ages, when you had overlapping authorities. If you were a peasant in a piece of land, you could have different authorities telling you owe them your allegiance. Authority was not terrestrially based like we do with nation states today. And if you go to places that have durable disorder, whether it be Africa or Afghanistan, people will say, well, I'm Congolese, but I'm actually from the Kivus first, and I'm from this family second. People have a list, a hardcore list of identity. It's not just I'm an American. And that was the case in this country too, before the Civil War. Does anybody know any here who is an officer in the Army or military? So you say you take an oath right now to who?
The Constitution.
To the Constitution, to the United States. Does anybody know what it would be before the Civil War?
Governors?
Not governors. Close. You would say you took a constitution to defend not the United States, but a United States. A United States. And you look at people like General Lee, and he felt he was loyal first to Virginia and then to the federal system. That all changed in our country too, but this is in our own history, is my point. All right? But this doesn't mean that the world's going to collapse and anarchy. The fact that we don't have a strong state system, as international relations explains to us, governing the world, governing security, doesn't mean that we're going to have sort of the Knights of Ni and the Holy Grail. It just means that we're going to have perpetual conflict and entropy, right? Forever wars, things like that. Here are some disturbing facts. 50% of all peace deals fail in 5 years. The majority of countries today are deemed fragile or failed, no matter what index you use. The number of armed conflicts has doubled since World War II. There's actually literature that shows that the Cold War was substantially safer than it is today. We could debate that because the threat of nuclear Armageddon was always, you were under the shadow of that. Conflicts today do not end. They persist in these forever wars, these never-ending wars. And that the rules-based order that we all love and cherish, it's limited now. It's limited. It's being replaced by something more organic and wild. So this book takes a position that those who, grasp this, who grasp durable disorder, can win, and those who do not will lose. All right? Meanwhile, we have a foreign policy of Humpty Dumpty. We're trying to go around the world and recreate the liberal world order as we like to perceive it from the last 70 years. Whether that's true or not is a different story. But my point is that this is not possible. We're not going to go back in time and recreate something. We have to learn how to live and deal with durable disorder today rather than to try to recreate a past, real or fictitious glory time. So we have a new type of global system, and it also has its own new type of warfare, and we need to get savvy on it. Some people think that now, because of national defense strategy, that our future war will be with Russia or China. That might be true, but then why does everybody assume it's going to be conventional? I don't know. Why do people assume that Russia and China will fight conventionally as if it's World War II, our preferred style of fighting? It won't. Conventional war is dead. The bigger question is, are we already at war with Russia and China and don't know it? And this is not new for us. We did this during the Cold War. Was the Cold War a real war? Was it a metaphor? What was it? Could be the same today. I'm not saying it's the new type of warfare. The future of war is not China using some big air-sea doctrine battle in the South China Sea. War is getting sneakier. It's getting more Sun Tzu. Crimea was taken. Russia could have blitzkrieged through eastern Ukraine. They had the military to do that, but they did not. They used covert and clandestine means like Spetsnaz special forces, like Little Green Men, like mercenaries, like proxy militias group. So by the time the frigates showed up in Sevastopol, it was already a fait accompli. And it was a brilliant strategy on Putin's part in some ways, because how can the US rally the world to defend the Ukraine when the basic facts were in question? In an information age, plausible deniability is more important than firepower. Same with the South China Sea. Same with, these are American mercenaries in Yemen, ex-SEALs, ex-Green Berets, acting as a hit squad for a Middle Eastern monarchy. Warfare has changed, and we can talk about this during Q&A, like the South China Sea, what's going on there if you wish. In the future, victory will belong to the cunning and not the strong. We're the strong. But I argue in this book that we're being outplayed strategically. Not operationally, not tactically. Nobody can stand up to the US operationally or tactically. It's at the strategic level that we fail. And this is what I mean by strategic atrophy. It's low strategic IQ. We suffer from a low strategic IQ. And we need things like SSP to help boost that. So for example, the idea of conventional war that victory occurs on a battlefield victory is almost irrelevant today. So where does victory occur? Well, it's in the realm of influence or other ways. So one of the rules, the new rules of war, is that some of the best weapons don't fire bullets. So obviously there's a whole Mueller probe going on. Did Russia try to manipulate our election? Right? Who cares about the sword when you can manipulate the arm that wields it? That's the logic of that strategy. How about this? When Russia, in the old days, old rules versus new rules. In the old days, when the USSR wanted to send a message to the West, it tried to use munitions. What it would often do is stage these huge military exercises right on the border of East and West Germany. For example, Zapad 81 had 150,000 Soviet soldiers massing on the border. And NATO freaked out. They're like, well, they say it's a military exercise, but what if it's not? What if it's a surprise attack, right? Well, now what Russia does when it wants to send a message or break up Europe to some extent, they don't use military means like that. They bomb civilians in Syria. They target civilian centers, help creating an avalanche of refugees that crashes into Europe and creates the Brexit, or the rise of right-wing parties across Europe that disfavor European Union, etc. So they're weaponizing refugees to some extent. Others are like China. Do you know China has bought Hollywood? Think about that soft power play and how powerful it really is. You cannot make a bad movie about China. They cannot be villains. They can only be heroes or superheroes. Think about that. So war has moved on. And we have to move on too. And that's why I wrote this book. Because even an undefeated military can lose a war. This is in 410, a depiction of 410. When the barbarians first sacked Rome, Rome thought itself pretty secure. The eternal city. Until 410. So we have to learn how to win in an age of durable disorder. And for this reason, I come up with, these are 10 rules, 10 principles, 10 maxims, I don't care what language you use to describe it, about how to win. About how to win. I explain for each one of these how to use them in some combination, or all. But to a standard traditional warrior's mind, this will create cognitive dissonance. But this is why we struggle. This is why we spend the most money of any military in the world, yet we get arguably the least results for it. That's not the fault of our troops or technology, etc. We have the best. It's because of strategic decrepitude. With that, I'll take your questions. Yes?
How would you reorganize the military to fit your vision of what needs to happen?
Yeah, I think somebody give me a softball question. So, I had this recently. If you're suck deaf, what would you do? Well, first of all, if you are sec deaf, so my advisor at Harvard was Ash Carter, way back before he became sec deaf, and I would sometimes ask him these questions, and he would have a very bureaucratic answer, I suppose. Look, I actually talk in this book. I talk about potential solutions. There's a lot of things I would do. So first of all, I would strip away all these traditional war weapons are the most expensive and least useful. I would do away with. Now that becomes a problem because whether you believe in a military-industrial complex or not, there is that complication. And it's curious now because we have an interim Secretary of Defense who's Mr. Boeing. That Eisenhower would be rolling his grave at high RPM right now. And probably McCain as well. The other thing I would do is this, and some of these are bold. I would flip who's in our reserves and who's in our active duty. So right now, for the US Army, most of our combat units are in active duty, and most of our reservists are combat support type things. Not with National Guard. But I would flip that. We don't, tanks are not needed anymore, right? I don't think so. They play and tanks were not needed even during the Gulf War I. Some argued this. But meanwhile, our combat service support, our combat support units are always deployed all the time. We need more of them, so maybe they should be in active duty all the time, and we'll take the big Red 1 infantry division and put it into the reserves, which would shock a lot of people. Also, why is it that the only people who can be 4-star generals in the Navy are either submariners or fighter aircraft pilots. Why are the only people who can be 4-star generals in charge of the Army, infantry, or armor? I would break that up. How about a 4-star who's intelligence or something else? We have the other thing is I would create more education. I mean, the military does a pretty good job with education, but it often reinforces the wrong lessons. So I would think we need more programs like this to help create strategists, but at an earlier age. Does anything know how old you are in the military before you go to war college and get your strategic education?
45.
You're at 45, usually at 40s, 40 someplace. maybe late 30s if you're a fast mover. I would argue that why do we wait that long, right? Let's do it when you're doing it. Now they don't have to be like 4-star generals at age 22, but let's incorporate that into the academies, into ROTC. So I would do a lot of things but these things fundamentally challenge the identity of the institution of the military. And this is not just a military problem, it's a whole of nation issue as well. So, why can we make it so the State Department has more educational opportunities or other things in the intelligence community? They really don't. I'm sure they would like it. Other questions? Back here, then we'll go to the side room.
Do you believe this period of durable disorder is inevitable, that the U.S. doesn't have the ability to reshape the international system, not so much in the Humpty Dumpty, we're going to get the liberal order back together style, but creating something that is not this durable disorder?
I agree.
Or
no,
is that just inevitable?
It's inevitable, and I'll tell you why in my opinion. Is because we all learn in political science that the birthday of the nation-state system of governance was 1648, right? That's actually wrong. If you actually read, has anybody here read the treaties of Munster or Westphalia from 1648, German? It's a ceasefire. Nowhere does it articulate a system of states. We've created this idea in the 19th century scholarship, reification of this system of states, which is really reading into a situation that didn't exist, and it became ossified in the 20th century scholarship. Most of world history is disorderly, all right? This idea of states as well. States are not universal and ancient. They're only about 400 years old. Does anybody know the biggest form of political organization or entity in history of humanity?
Monarchy?
Well, empire. Empire and tribes. You could argue tribes. Empire, not states. States are like, they're a momentary blip. And so if you look at the history of world order, you'll see it's mostly messy, mostly disordered. But again, it didn't come apart, and it seems the way that people assume that, what will the world look like without the governance of states, without the governance of Westphalian states? It'll be just fine. Somalia, for all its horrendousness, it does have some sort of governance there. Same with I used to live in Africa in these places. They have their own local governance. I'm not saying we should strive for that or that's good, but it's this idea that the world's gonna, the sky is falling, we have to invest in more sky. I think that's the wrong approach. Yes, sir.
Yeah. So first off, with what you mentioned about Westphalian sovereignty being a kind of silly thing, I've also thought for a really long time calling it Westphalian sovereignty is a really kind of dumb idea, and I don't care if I'm on record saying that.
You're on record saying that.
Yeah, that's fine. Whatever it is, I just don't like the term Westphalian sovereignty. Anyway, so yeah, when you're looking at especially parts of the world where there is kind of like conventional war, like in Yemen now. I mean, like, is this kind of just the aberration, or is there, like, what would you say about, like, since you mentioned before, like, peace treaties don't tend to survive, like, I mean, what's next for places like that, where there is going to be some kind of conventional war? I mean, is it all going to be resolved through non-conventional means?
Well, I kind of disagree that Yemen's a conventional war. Having conventional war aspects to a larger war doesn't make it a conventional war. So look at the U.S. Civil War, for example. When does the U.S. Civil War start and end? 61 to 65? Right. You could make the argument it went from 1850 to 1878. Right? Bleeding Kansas, Missouri, that was a regular war going on. before the conventional stage even occurred. And then the Reconstruction with the KKK insurgency, you could argue that's also warfare. It's also warfare. So, I think that we will see elements of conventional war in the future, but just because 1/10 of it might be conventional doesn't make it a conventional war. I'm not sure if that's what your question was, but I don't see conventional war like World War II occurring again. I don't see China doing that right now. I mean, it's amazing. You ask, now this town has a habit of auto-populating expertise. So, 10 years ago, you couldn't find a Russian expert. Now there's Russian experts everywhere, right? Same with Chinese. And the thing that really irritates me, at China especially, is you have these experts and think tanks who don't speak any Chinese. Yeah. And they before 2 years ago, they were an Al-Qaeda expert or ISIS expert. It's just, nobody can really take them, or nobody should take them that seriously. A lot of them are theory and such a fact. Where I'm going with this is this. Where am I going with this? Do you know? Help remind me.
So as far as with, how do we resolve sort of conventional war?
Right.
I mean, that has conventional aspects, and I guess if you're getting at from the solution phase.
What I'm getting at is that all these Chinese experts, China has a very clear strategy for the South China Sea. They have a very clear strategy to get the U.S. out of their region. It's called the three warfare strategy. How come nobody's heard about it in Washington, D.C.? I don't know. But the three warfare strategy, it's media influence, it's lawfare, and it's cyber stuff. Something like that, the third, I forget. But it's not carrier groups. They're not investing in carriers, yet they're winning. Because they're fighting with the new rules of war, we're fighting the old rules of war. And that's why I'm pessimistic that we'll see conventional war happen again. Yes, back here.
So assuming you could convince those inside the Pentagon that this was valid,
Yeah.
how do you convince them, or more so, how do you have them sell it to policymakers who are elected by a constituency that glorifies the military, doesn't hold it accountable for anything that it really does because there's no ramifications? I think that the way we've conducted wars has been successful because we're on quote-unquote a winning streak,
Yeah.
or we can discount the fact that we have lost. Do we need to actually lose before we can sell to the American public that essentially generate the political will to do something
Sure.
in order to have change?
So you ask a very important question. And what we really need is we need to have a national discourse on the forever war situation, right? Now, am I optimistic that in today's political environment that's going to happen anytime soon? No, I'm with you on this. But that's partly why I wrote this book. And also why I wrote it for a mass audience. And it's deliberately a little provocative. Because if you write, well-mannered academic prose, nobody's going to read it who is the constituency you've outlined. And so when I present this, when I wrote it, when I present it, I'm a little piquant about it. Because we need to have people stop and think about this. One of the, I think that we do over-glorify the military a little too much. And that can be dangerous, just like we vilify them too much in the Vietnam era, which is also dangerous. But I do think that one of the lessons that comes out of this book, especially if you look at, number 5, rule 5, is that the military may not be the best weapon for modern warfare. And if you look at our own budget, budgets are moral documents because they do not lie. Our budget, if you take out entitlement programs like, Social Security and Medicare and Medicaid, if you look at what we spend on our interagency, it's like a fiddler crab. The fiddler crab has like one huge claw, the tiny little micro claw next to it. That one claw is DOD and everybody else is that tiny claw. And I think the first thing I would do if I could, if I was, your question, if I was like God, not SecDef, but God, I would slash the DOD budget. I would slash it and give taxpayers a break and spend more money elsewhere. Because I think this harbors and encourages this conventional war mentality. You've heard the maxim of, if all you have is a hammer, every problem looks like a nail. That's what we do now, is what we have like, there's a problem someplace in the world, can we do airstrikes? We do means-driven strategy, and we wonder why it doesn't yield political results. All right, go here and then we'll go back here.
I was wondering if you could, to go back to the Yemen example, you
Yes.
started talking about how in the problem that the Western states have been losing these wars by trying to use conventional means. But in Yemen, you're having the UAE and Saudi more increasingly using unconventional means like mercenaries, for example.
Yes.
And yet they're still losing. Do you think that this is something that they're going to be able to turn around? Do you think it's just a matter of time?
No, I think that they're trying to adapt it to the new rules of war, like using mercenaries, for example. But they're just sucking at it. So it's a difference, right? It's a difference. I mean, the Saudi, this is the Saudis' first war of choice since what, 62 or so? I don't even recall. And it's I think most people would agree it's not gone well. It's not going well for MBS. But I think the only thing we can see at Yemen is that it's an example of strategic adaptation or the attempt to do so. But we have a culture, and so do they, where we don't have leaders reckon strategy with adaptability very well. Question over here. Yes, ma'am.
Thank you for coming to talk with us today. I wanted to ask a question about drivers. You mentioned that right off the bat in the next 25 years, the nature of war and perhaps also the nature of the international system will markedly change. And you also mentioned sort of this past tendency within the U.S. military to choose conventional, large-scale conventional warfare to engage in the international system in this way. But I'm assuming that's not the only driver from your mind's eye. So
Sure.
if you talk a little bit more about the drivers in that change.
Well, the drivers are many and complex. So there's a whole literature in the 1990s and 2000 about state failure, the wild state failure, and globalization, and those are all drivers of this. In this book, I don't get into too much detail about this because the audience I'm writing for does not need to know this. So in my first nonfiction book, an Oxford University Press book called The Modern Mercenary, I discuss the idea of durable disorder. I discuss some of the primary drivers. But I will say that my discussion of that is more a synthesis rather than original ideas, because there is a vast literature out there on the sources of conflict, the sources of fractured sovereignty, all these things. I think one area that's not been looked at very carefully is the rise of private military force. Private military force mercenaries, I think, is one of the single biggest threats to international relations today. But it's emblematic of durable disorder. It's not a cause of it. And the reason it's so important is because we're totally unprepared for this. Mercenaries are the second oldest profession. Most of military history is privatized. Mercenaries have been around forever. It's only 1850 that they really disappeared or were driven underground. So but we forget this. We've excised it from our collective memory. But what happens when you privatize war? Warfare changes. Suddenly, think of like Clausewitz meets Adam Smith. Our generals are completely unprepared for waging a war where market strategies are effective in warfare. So CEOs in Wall Street might be better equipped to wage such a war than our current breed of four-star. That's why it's so dangerous. Yeah, let's go. Some people haven't seen. It's back here, way back there. Yeah.
So your rule number 6, you were just talking about mercenaries will return,
Yes.
seems to feed directly into rules 7, 8, and 9.
It does.
Because they're good at those rules.
Yes.
Do you think that there is a way in which, even in a durable disorder, in order to protect their interests, sovereign states might try and again push mercenaries out of the equation in some way? And how do you think they might be most successful at doing so?
Yeah, so I think that world peace would be easier than that. So like the question of how did the world get rid of mercenaries the first time? And I've talked to different historians about this and nobody really knows. I mean, people have theories about 1648, but like what exactly and how, and nobody really knows. And could Russia and China and America and the United Nations and everybody, could they all agree to monopolize the market for force the way that powers did in the 17th century or 18th century? I don't know. I don't think it's likely. We're not even sure how that happened the first time around. But I do think that what's going to happen with 6, 7, 8, and 9 is that mercenaries will return. Number 7 is new types of world powers will emerge. This is like supply and demand. Think of, the Fortune 500 is more powerful than most of the 190 or so states in the world, right? Especially extractive industry. And they're tired of being shook down by corrupt governments. So now that mercenaries are available and de facto legitimized by the United States of America, who use them for 10 years heavily, I think they're going to start using these more and more. Also, random billionaires, oligarchs. Did you know that 62 individuals in this world possess the equivalent of half the world's wealth? Will they defend it with violence if necessary? You bet they will. You bet they will. So we're going to see private wars. And private wars is this dangerous combination of Clausewitz meets Adam Smith that we're not ready for. We used to know how to do that. We, like in the Middle East, Machiavelli existed in a world of private warfare. And he wrote The Prince and bewailed it. Like private warfare, he said, turn soldiers into beasts and people into victims. And that's, and mercenaries, and, they don't work themselves out of a job very well. So I think these are all part of the durable disorder, part of the persistent conflict that we'll see in the future. Yes?
So we've talked a little bit about the future of our ideas of sovereignty and like what a state is, and rule number 8 is there will be wars without states.
Yes.
I was wondering, outside of the durable disorder, because traditionally wars ended by either conquering a country or signing a peace deal.
Yeah.
Is it possible to have peace deals? Is it possible to find a semblance of peace between two organizations that a lot of the world politically may not see as legitimate, like even the United States dealing with the Taliban, and how do we overcome that under these new rules? Do we even look for peaceable solutions, or is it more of existing inside of a permanent warlike state?
Well, I think we have to be humble about how much of a peace deal we can strike in Afghanistan. And if we want a peace deal in Afghanistan, it's got to include all Afghans to include the Taliban, right? Otherwise, it might end up like the end of Vietnam, where we made a peace deal, and then 3 months later, North Vietnamese swept into South Vietnam, and the US is like, sucks to be you, right? And we do that to the Kurds quite often. And that's sort of realpolitik, and I'm not saying it's bad, but it's the way it is. My point is that we already have wars without states. If you look at Central America, if you look at, rather than states becoming movers of warfare, they become booty in warfare. They become loot. Then they call them narco states. And can cartels make peace deals with each other? Yes, they do. Why do we not privilege that as a peace treaty, right? Well, because we're stuck in a state-centric paradigm. And that's a paradigm. So that's what I'm trying to break in this rules too. Yes?
Is the only impetus for foreign affairs under this framework essentially the propagation either of extractive industries or domestic industries that need to secure international markets for sales or purchases? Because it seems to not have a morality or theoretical drive for engagement with other nations.
No, I don't think so. I think Russia and China are fighting with these rules right now, and they both imagine a greater Russia, a greater China. I think terrorist groups are fighting these rules right now, and they imagine a greater caliphate. There's a lot of moral components to that. I'm not advocating for morality, and I think that morality has done more harm than good for U.S. grand strategy, right? So like the Truman Doctrine, promoting democracy everywhere, I think has yielded more harm than good in the Middle East and other parts of the world. I think that the idea that we are all about promoting democracy, but we make allies with Saudi Arabia equally problematic. It might be cleaner just to be more realpolitik about our grand strategy and say, we do what's necessary to achieve these national interests, and we'll take ideology off that table. Not everybody would agree with that, but that's, that would be my perspective. Does it make it nihilist? Does it make it survivalist? Does it make it, that's a different question here, and then in the back. Yeah, no, you, and then we'll go behind you.
Going off of that, you mentioned, and according to these rules here, autocracies seem to have a lot of advantages when it comes to this next, perhaps return to normal for war. do democracies have any advantages, perhaps in
Yes.
the private sector, and how can democratic states better use these advantages?
So this is a great question because part of war is going underground. I rule number 9 is something called shadow war. This is where you fight wars that are disguised as something else or using covert and clandestine means. And we know from the Church Commission era here that secrets and democracy are not compatible. We also know that from Thucydides that democracies are not particularly good at fighting wars. They tend to become more autocratic over time and they can lose their soul. So this does concern me, and I raise this in the book. I do suggest that we can do shadow wars. We did it during the Cold War, but not always with good example. We win the shadow war, but then we like mess up what happens afterwards. Excuse me. So a good example of this, I'm leaving ethics out of this because we're discussing war, is Guatemala 53, right? When the CIA kind of using a shadow war basically convinced the duly elected president Arbenz of Guatemala to flee the country. They faked him out. You know, that's new rules of war. But the CIA, for all its many sins during this time frame, got basically neutered in the 70s, and justly so. So the question of what kind of regime thrives and does well in this is a good question, and one that should concern us, but that's beyond the scope of this book. But I think that's an important question to ask ourselves. Back here, yes. There's two back here. Yeah, yes.
How's it going?
Yes, good. It's good to see you.
So, rules 1 and rules 2.
Yeah.
Imagine that the Chief of Staff of the Air Force and
Yeah.
Navy.
Yeah, they're not gonna like that.
That's reading those. Right?
Yeah.
For the capital-intensive services like the Air Force and the Navy, SWOs and fighter pilots, they advocate for bigger ships and fighters, right?
Yep.
What do you think this does? Like, how do we manufacture cunning, 1?
Yep.
And then 2, does this mean that there's incredible emphasis on the role of SecDef in the future?
Well, the question of the SecDef, I mean, the SecDef is like, you know, he or she, like the president, can really change maybe 1 or 2 things. And they have to pick what those things are, and then that's in reality. So they're kind of in a box more than we give them credit for. But I think, 1 and 2 will really push back on the traditionalists, which are the Navy and the Air Force, who for the last 20 years have felt like they've been left out in the cold. Right? But I'm okay with that because the Department of State needs some more love and attention. I think the IC, we need, you know, information is critical in this way of warfare. I think, IC reform is like another, only God can make that happen. But that we need to do more of that as well. But I do think, like the Air Force, the Navy, I would ask them honestly, like, you want more carriers in the South China Sea, but that's not deterring anybody. So what's the logic here? They get to ask tough questions, and them saying, we just bought 8 more submarines, right? Why? Why are we buying the F-35? Why? Right? Because it's a needed weapon. Well, beyond that, General, tell me why. I think also there's a lot of conflict of interest across Washington, D.C. that we should expose. And it's not just, it is not just Eisenhower, it's also Teddy Roosevelt who talks about this. That you can look at the history of our country, that the double helix of our country's DNA is business and politics from the very beginning. And this particularly ramped up after World War II, where we never deindustrialized the military from World War II. We kept it going. And that's what Eisenhower was talking about. And the fact that we have a Boeing guy, again, who could fire me, Shanahan, tomorrow, I suppose. But the point is that, he is pure Boeing. He's never done anything else. He's now in charge of the primary client. What does that tell us? So, yeah, I think, the Air Force, and then, but I do think there's a role for them, but it's not as they perceive it themselves. And, okay, behind you, somebody had their hand up. Did you have your hand up? Okay, yes.
Yeah. So, in some ways, if, nothing is conventional war, then what is conventional war, in a way? So, because, 6-Day War, or Desert Storm, or Iran-Iraq War, if those aren't conventional, and then,
Okay, well, first of all, what time does this end? 1 o'clock? 1:30. 1:30? Okay, good. I want to make sure you're... okay. So here's where I disagree with some of my colleagues. Frank Hoffman is a dear friend of mine and a good colleague. I don't believe in hybrid war. I don't believe in conventional versus unconventional. I think war is war. It's a broad spectrum, and it's not a linear progression from one side to the other. So, and I think attempts to do that, all it does is create endless academic debates around taxonomy, which yield very little results on the ground. I think we're just better to think of war as armed politics, and then move forward. So I don't spend time thinking about where does unconventional war end and conventional war begin.
But if we're saying that conventional war is dead,
Yeah.
then does it just mean naming types of wars?
Yeah. So in the book, in that first rule, I explained what I told you. Like, conventional war is really a type of warfare. It's you know the difference between war and warfare, right? It is the West's favorite way to fight. It's a type of warfare. It's actually not conventional war. It's dead. We don't fight that way anymore. And oh, by the way, the whole tradition of conventional versus unconventional, symmetrical versus asymmetrical, regular versus irregular, it's all hokum, and it's confusing to us. Because what happens is that once we know it's one bin versus the other, we proceed with certain strategic assumptions which are wrong. Same with like narco wars in Latin America. We view that as criminality and not as armed conflict. And so we think our law enforcement lens goes on, and then that's, we have problems with that. So I look at that as like, that's a type of warfare. It doesn't register on our scale, and many of these types of wars don't even look like wars to a traditional thinker, which is why it's so dangerous.
If we want to do these things in a codified system, like pursue war legally, don't we need these definitions to a point to say that this type of warfare is different than this type of warfare?
Yeah, well, how many times have we declared war in the last 70 years? This is going to be controversial, but when we try to wrap war around legal systems, I think that's hubris, and I think that there's very little. Lawyers do not run our strategy in this country. Now there are some who think that should be the case, and they're usually in The Hague. But look at The Hague. Africans think that The Hague is a racist organization. Why is Putin not a criminal for taking the Crimea? But Kenyatta is. It's so like all these questions arise. But if you're a legalist, then you need bins and categories. But that's not where I'm thinking. Okay. Yes, sir.
And so again, we appreciate you speaking to us today.
Yeah.
What you classify there as your 10 rules is, it's typically, I think, doctrinally right now in the Army interpreted as irregular warfare.
Yeah.
I think conventional war is kind of what they describe as decisive action, as it were. And I think you're right, the most likely course of action in the recent past and going forward is that irregular warfare spectrum.
Yeah.
Would you agree, though, that, and I think we've seen SOCOM and the interagency really evolve to be massive participants in that realm, at least the most competitive, I think, that the DoD and DOS can offer. But would you agree that potentially the creation of variable disorder is a function of a deterrent, which is the air-land battle, if it were, in the 80s and 90s, where the U.S. military got so good at decisive action with the investment in all these capital enterprises and this fourth, fifth generation capabilities, that the world kind of, again, as a deterrent, moved away from that to asymmetric capabilities, which has caused the rise of so many of these other conflicts. And if we give up on investing in those conventional means and dominance in that decisive action realm, then the world will be more likely to compete with us in that phase of joint conflict.
I hear what you're saying. I don't agree with it, and I'll tell you why. Is that so certainly our decisiveness in one aspect of warfare, like air-land battle, pushed weaker adversaries to adapt to it, right? But irregular war, sticking to this phrase, which I do not like, to your earlier question, but sticking to that phrase, it existed. It was not invented in the 1980s. It's been around forever. One of the examples I look at, rule number 10 is victory is fungible is an important one. It means there's many ways to win wars. And there are strategies that exist where you can win, a weak opponent can win against a strong one with a weak military, and sometimes not even military at all. Now, strategies exist. We don't teach them in our war colleges. Why not? I do not know. We do it at the war college I'm at. We teach Mao, who teaches you how to do this. And it's not even an original idea for him. He's taking the Fabian strategy from the Second Punic War. there are strategies that the weak can use that don't involve decisive battlefield victory. And even if we achieve decisive battlefield victory today, it doesn't decide much, if anything at all. I mean, think of George W. Bush on the aircraft carrier in the spring of 2003 saying missions accomplished, right? So this is where I depart with some of the more operational art thinking of the military and think about when you win, how do you win? Where's victory found if it's not on the battlefield? You know, depends on your opponent. So, I mean, anyway, there's lots of examples. So like in World War I, Germany was caught between two fronts. That was their nightmare, East and West. And the way they got rid of the Eastern Front finally was not through 3 million men marching into the Soviet Union. They did it through a clever ruse. They took Vladimir who's the other guy? Lenin! Vladimir, I was getting mixed up. They took Lenin and his coterie from Switzerland on a sealed train, and they shot him like a virus into the Soviet Union. And that's kind of what did it. I mean, there were a couple revolutions before that in 1917, but the final sort of like, that was done by the Minister of Foreign Affairs, Kremen, it's in the book. But, you know, that's an example of victory is fungible. You don't have to like kill more enemies, take more territory, and fly your flag over the capital to win. But we're stuck in that paradigm. And we're not alone. Some other Western countries are too. Yes?
So you were kind of talking about how the covert arm of the CIA got neutered in the 70s with the Church Committee. Are there any examples that you point to, you're saying ethics aside, that were strategically successful that the CIA were able to do before they had oversight in the 50s and 60s? Like,
well, it's a Faustian bargain, right? I don't want to sit up here and say that we should do more like, you know, Iran, Guatemala's, but we have done it before. If we do a better job of it, maybe. You know, I don't know. I mean, like you're talking about modern examples, and if we had like less governing on the agency, it could yield results for us.
Well, I'm saying, for example, like, would you consider Guatemala or Congo in the early '60s as having been strategic successes and something that we're going to have to figure out a way to get back to fighting in that way? Or do you kind of look back on that and say they weren't successful? No,
I do. Guatemala was a success, but with caveats, heavy caveats. And what really was the problem is like what happened afterwards, what the U.S. did afterwards was pretty awful. And also getting to the question of ideology and grand strategy, the U.S.'s question, or like, what does it mean to be a Truman Doctrine, you know, person, but we're overthrowing legitimately elected leaders for the sake of United Fruit, a corporation? When we also talked about the multinational complex and the DNA of business and politics. I mean, so Guatemala has a lot of significant flaws to it. It really shows an operational win, and that type of operation will yield more results for us in the future than, say, more aircraft carriers. But also managing the perils of that, I try to be open-eyed about that as well, and transparent about that. And certainly if you talk about, like, you know, there's a lot of Guatemalan refugees in this town, for example, that came out of the multiple civil wars from that era. Spawned in that era. But yeah. So the book in Shadow War, Rule 9, it goes into some of these questions. Sorry, yeah, without getting to it right now. Yes, back here, and then this.
So in this kind of alluding to age of hyper competition, we're headed towards.
Yeah.
And DIME, you know, the letters seem to be blurring more and more together.
Yes.
What sorts of institutions does the U.S. possess? I guess economically or any other purviews outside of military, or specifically military support and intelligence outside of those purviews?
Yeah.
Where are we strong? How can we strengthen those?
Well, this is a great question, and I don't address this in the book because it's more of it's like the next tier, right? I think we have a bureaucracy that's structured after World War II to deal with interstate Westphalian threats. And that's a cultural thing too, not just a wire diagram. That's a problem. Like, who do we call when we, you know, can we do negotiations with non-state actors easily? Not really. So I think that's a problem. I think also the public-private partnerships in our country, that's how do we get around that? You know, that's more and more important. But we're dealing with adversaries we don't have to deal with this, like Beijing. right? And the thing about Beijing is that scholars were wrong about China, really wrong for 25 years. They kept on assuring us all that you can't be a global economic powerhouse with a state-controlled economy. And then lo and behold, we have Beijing. Now, which is scheduled to surpass the US sometime in the next 15 years as the biggest economic powerhouse. Who knows what the future will hold? It could all implode tomorrow, it could all not. I don't know, but I think that scholarship was tinged with confirmation bias about this, and that's I don't discuss it directly in here, but it's the same pathology. Yeah.
So I have a second part that's kind of connecting to almost everything you said your core idea. I mean, is there a way that we can succeed without changing our culture?
I do think so, but I think we're going to have to change it around the margins. I mean, like the idea of glorified, one of the biggest reasons that we fail is because of Hollywood. Hollywood puts visions in our head about what war looks like and the future of war, and it impacts us here. So Iron Man creates the Iron Man suit here. We love technology. We have there's this thing, there's like this mechanical robotic ass. It's a robot ass. Okay, a mule, right? You know what I'm saying. All right. So, like, Boston Dynamics, somebody has spent like $45 million for like 10 years creating a prototype. That's talk about waste of money. And this thing, like, stands up and it starts marching, and it's supposed to carry Special Forces luggage around the battlefield. That's its main purpose. What's that? Yeah, but the problem is, everybody seen this thing? It sounds like a lawnmower. It can't go everywhere Special Forces troops can walk. And if it breaks down in the field, good luck getting parts, right? The truth is, an old-fashioned mule would be much better and cheaper. That is the perversion of our culture. And I'm okay about changing that, but we have to, we have this thing called DUIX, right? Everybody know this thing? It's like, it's basically a slush fund, and I think it's a slush fund in Silicon Valley, where it's just like, $100 billion, just come on over. You don't have to even be profitable, just help us do better with technology. This idea that technology will save us is wrong. We've been constantly defeated by Luddites. The last, 70 years of war, 70 years in the last 70 years, all the big powers have been defeated by Luddites. If there's one rule that is absolutely decisive in the last 70 years of war, it's that technology makes no difference. We are humbled to this day by the humble roadside bomb. We've spent millions trying to defeat the roadside bombs of Iraq. Millions. And it doesn't work. So I think that we have some strategic cultural baggage that we have to get rid of, the exercise. Let's go over here and then back here. Yeah.
Yeah, this is maybe related. It seems, and I could be misreading this because it's just short presentation, but it seems like a lot of these rules need sort of revisionist powers, for lack of a better word. Is the U.S. and our other status quo powers who would rather just avoid war at a systematic disadvantage in this kind of world? And can we reverse that in a way without just either waiting for the next war and then intervening decisively, or just getting a lot more activists trying to revise the status quo to be more stable?
So I wrote this book because I don't want to have to wait for a Verdun moment before we strategically adapt, which is generally how it happens. It takes a lot of blood for militaries to change the way they fight. And even then it doesn't often happen. But yeah, the West has not won wars. It stopped winning wars 70 years ago. And we should really be concerned about this. Yet the revisionist powers, as you've described it, are doing all these things. China and Russia are winning not because they're fighting conventionally, because they're not fighting conventionally. And we have a self-inflicted strategic wound that we don't have to deal with it right now because it's not existential for us right now, but at some point it might be. And I want to get ahead of that curve. And you don't have to agree with all these rules, but my point is, as Machiavelli says, an archer aims high, pulling back the bow, knowing that the arrow will arc and lower. So if I can get some people in our national security establishment to start thinking about this, they may not agree, but the only way to pull them across the line a little bit is to be provocative, not in a sort of circus act way, but asking hard questions like, why has the West not won, and what's keeping us back? And I think that's Those are tough questions to ask.
Look, I
Yeah.
can ask that as like.
Yeah, yeah. Mhm.
What does a case study of like a victory for the U.S. look like with these kind of rules? If you could pick any issue that there is now, or
Well, I think the first thing I'm going to do is stop invading countries, right? I mean, how many thousands of American troops have we lost? How many trillions of dollars have we spent? Our national image is tarnished against low-level enemies, and we resolve nothing politically on the ground. So, you know, it's like medicine. The first rule is do no harm, right? Or the rule of ditch digging or hole digging. The first rule is stop. So we need to stop. We need to have a pause. It doesn't mean we're going to be isolationist. We can have a discussion about what would a grand strategy around this look like, and I have a section in the book on grand strategy. But the problem is we also have in this town confusion about what grand strategy even is. You have preeminent scholars here talking about grand strategies for different administrations that they don't get it. What makes a grand strategy grand is that it lasts through multiple administrations, regardless of political party or type of government. So we just, in some ways, our strategic IQ in this town is very, very low, but we have the power to improve it, and it's actually much cheaper than another F-35. So that's why I'm optimistic. This is a good news story, not a bad news story. The fix for this is doable, easy, and immediate. We don't have to wait 50 years. We don't have to spend $1 zillion. You know, it's something we can't fix like our geography. It's doable right now. Yeah.
So earlier on, you said you don't think another aircraft carrier, for instance, would improve deterrence. So could you elaborate on that? Why wouldn't aircraft carriers or aircraft or troops or well-equipped allies in the Pacific or Europe improve deterrence? And also, under the new rules, what role does nuclear deterrence play?
So, good question. So right now, the Pentagon is obsessed with deterrence. I submit, my opinion is that deterrence doesn't really work anymore because we live in an age of non-attribution. Shadow war, it's like cyber war, right? Shadow war is you don't know exactly where the attack came from, so do you go to war against it? And one of the things of shadow war too is that you can frame your enemies. You can do black flag operations and do mimicry operations, which makes it so dangerous. And if that's the case, that type of strategic logic, what good is deterrence, right? I mean, also our deterrence is not working. It's not stopping Russia. It's not stopping China. So, and aircraft carriers, we have the best aircraft carriers, but who cares? We have to look at the data. The data shows us that it's not curbing belligerent behavior of terrorists, revisionist powers, rogue states, whatever. So why do we cling to this Cold War, old rules of war notion in deterrence? So the new rules of war, there is no deterrence. At least not that looks like that. And nuclear weapons has always been a debate about how effective nuclear weapons were as a deterrent in the Cold War. That's an ongoing debate historians have had. I think most people say, yeah, mutually assured destruction had a deterrent effect, but where's the line? And that you see this when we go from Eisenhower to Kennedy's reflexive response. There's this great show that you should all watch called Yes Minister, or Yes Prime Minister. It's an old BBC show from the early 80s. It's like it's a satire. It's cleverly written, and it's all about it's like getting a PhD in electoral politics. And there's this great episode on deterrence, how good or how bad, and this is during the 80s. So I have always been a little bit dubious on, but I do think what might happen in the future is limited nuclear warfare. Why do we assume that nuclear taboo will last forever? And I think it's very dangerous, and I don't really know where that leads. So nuclear weapons are still very, very relevant, but not as a deterrent against great power near peers. Back here, and then.
For assuming that we don't experience an immediate and drastic shift in the strategic culture of our country, what advice would you have for those of us who are going to be stuck operating at the tactical or operational level for the foreseeable future? Assuming that we understand and agree with and kind of see the wisdom in some of these rules.
So are you a military officer or not?
Yeah.
Okay. So you are probably stuck for a while. Now, that said, you will have opportunities to be an aide de camp or to work at strategic levels or staffs, you can talk to people. And I think that socializing these ideas, asking hard questions is good. I wish that we had strategy at USMA, right? I wish we had that.
So they actually started, I was going to bring this up to you afterwards.
Yeah.
They started a Defense and Strategic Studies program.
Yeah, yeah, I know.
It's one major of many.
But that's good. We need more stuff like that. We need more of that. And I think that another area is that if you are in a military, so unfortunately, I think some of the areas that like FAOs or working on the Hill are kind of career enders, but you have the most opportunity to shape these things. And it's unfortunate. Like if you want to be the chief of staff for the Army, there's a very linear path you kind of have to take with some luck. But I do think that officer and SAMs is supposed to do some of this stuff, right? They're like high operational art. But I think there look for opportunities. There will be opportunities. I think that you're not alone. My students at National Defense University are lieutenant colonels and colonels, and there's a lot of sympathy for this. It's, these are not all original ideas. I hope you know. Some of these rules are ancient, some are new. And I'm not the first person to say some of these things either. There's a lot of interest out there at the ground level and the mid-grades level. So do not be despondent that it's like you and this crowd with brilliant young thinkers. There are people out there. Just, do you know what your next assignment is?
CGSE.
Okay, so you'll have a, but we call it the blob. It's like the national security establishment that exists out there. And it exists in this town as well. And they like to push back against anything that doesn't look traditional. So I would say go in and ask hard questions, be a critical thinker, and look for opportunities. And we're getting more and more like that. So when I was an officer in the early 90s and I was a cadet in the late 80s, it was still like Tom Clancy all the way, but look how far we've come. So it's not, but the Army is hard to reform. Who else? Yes.
Something you mentioned now in the class was that CEOs may be the new best war strategists.
Or parts of it, or some combination, yeah.
And I think it's clear, very clear, particularly with Silicon Valley, that other than the traditional defense contracting companies, there is a lot of distrust and dislike between CEOs and the military.
Yeah.
So what would you say is a solution to get more buy-in from the non-traditional defense side of
It's a great question. So the military culture does not reward entrepreneurial thinking, and the private sector does, right? So the cultures are very different. And I would love to, like part of Rule 9 or 10, I talk about what should the strategic curriculum of the military be, or the whole across the national security establishment. It needs to be more of a mix of entrepreneurial thinking and, so we have things like this. That's not going to happen tomorrow, but I think that strategy courses should teach, basically like Ender's Game, or read the book by Orson Scott Card. They had, if there's any model in that, they're like, it's conventional war, I get that, but like, can we create like an interesting system that can spot, identify, and develop natural strategists from an early age? West Point kind of does that for tactical genius. How do you do that for strategic genius? That's what we need to think about. How do you create that program? And in some ways, SSP and public policy schools try to do that. And I think working in sort of the business ideas and entrepreneurship and what that looks like, that would be the place to do it. But it's a good question. Yes?
Sean, I'm curious as to how you can have a rule that says there is no such thing as war and then entitle your book The New Rules of War.
That's a great question. Actually, this is...
I think you've defined, you stretched war to the point where it has no meaning.
Where do you see this rule? I see there's no such thing as war and peace. Number 3. So there's no such thing as war and peace. There's no such... What this means is that what you can't see on this, it says both coexist always. All right? So, for example, we in the West, our strategic paradigm is that war is like pregnancy. You either are or you aren't. War is the failure of peace. War is the failure of peace. So you were at peace until the Japanese bombed Pearl Harbor. then you go to war, you fight the war, and then you go back to peace. You have a USS Missouri and a ceasefire, and then we're looking around like, why can't we get a USS Missouri moment with Al-Qaeda? But that's not how war is fought anymore. And if you look at the South China Sea, this is how, in part, China wins. Is they get in that space, our self-identified space of there's war or peace. They get in the middle of that space of war and peace and exploit it. They do actions that go right up to the brink of war and they stop so that they don't provoke a reaction on our part, but they keep what they take. So that's their strategy of how they're going to get the South China Sea one island and one ally at a time. It's incremental warfare that exploits our, in my opinion, false notion of war versus peace. It's actually an and equation. There's war and peace. Again, the Cold War is actually something we're pretty adept at in this. Yes, sir. And then back here.
So kind of alluding to gray zone strategies used by the Russians and the Chinese, do you think that that's something that we should incorporate into our PME?
I do. I hate the term gray zone.
Whatever
okay,
you call it.
I just, because gray zone's a big amorphous mess. It's like a bumper sticker to me. You ask people what gray zone is, and they're like, it's like cyber war. They're everywhere, you know? But yeah, I do. I think we need to have a PME that stresses these things, right? I mean, why do we look at just kinetic force as the primary driver of international politics? So yeah, I would like to liberalize it. Yes.
So in this kind of pseudo-medieval structure that you say that we're returning to, what role does the internet play and what role does civil society play?
Well, okay, so I think the internet, what time is it? Okay, sorry. Okay, one more question after this, so quickly. So I think cyber is really important, but not in the ways that people think it is. People think of cyber, its job as sabotage, like Stuxnet, but in truth, Stuxnet was ineffective. It didn't stop or even retard the Iranian nuclear program. It's a lot of hype. But its power is propaganda, right? And what the internet does is it allows us to do old things in new ways. It allows us to do propaganda, theft, sabotage, and criminality. There's nothing new about that. It's not a new way of war or even warfare, you know. So but civil society that's a different question. I don't have time for that. Last question, then we'll go. Yeah.
So going back to Rule 3,
yeah.
The latest national military strategy discusses war and peace on this complex continuum and kind of acknowledges, I think, a little bit Rule 3 in saying that a state of war and peace isn't binary.
Yeah.
And our relations with other countries, other entities fall somewhere on this spectrum all the time. So I'm just wondering to what extent you're encouraged by that, or you view that as an acknowledgement of that rule, or maybe we haven't gone far enough in our understanding of that.
No, I'm encouraged by it, but we haven't gone far enough. So like Nadia Shadlow, who helped pen the national security strategy, Frank Hoffman, who helped pen the national defense strategy, they get it. But they also have internal constituents in the Department of Defense who's like, no, there's only the war or peace, and they have a very traditional view of war, because they learned about this, you know, their models for war are the World War II and the Civil War. That's all they studied, right? But yeah, there's recognition, I think, amongst a lot of strategic thinkers and leaders that this binary war-peace thing is not serving us well. And again, all we got to do is go back to the Cold War. We've been here before in our lifetimes, in our living memory. In this, you know, so we need to think, how did we do with it back then? And I think that's going to look like the future. I'm not saying we're going to have a new Cold War with Russia against the US. I'm not getting that literal. That's the danger of the Cold War analogy. People immediately put on their Cold Warrior hat, and that's just not correct. But I'm optimistic that people are coming around to this. And again, I'm not the first to say some of these things, right? By any stretch of the imagination. So I think things are moving in this direction. The question is, how can we make it more rapid so we don't get caught in some sort of verdun moment 10 years from now? Because never say never. Okay, with that, thank you very much for your day. I know it's a January cold day. It's a pleasure.